Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Good afternoon. This is the third of our webinar series, Getting the Right Permits. This is a series of historic preservation and coastal flooding webinar series that we've put together, co-hosted by the Washington Trust for Historic Preservation with our program, the Maritime Washington National Heritage Area. My name is Moira Nadal. I am the Trust's Historic Preservation Programs Director. I have in our meeting my colleague Alex, who will introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Gradwell. I am the Program Director of the Maritime Washington National Heritage Area here at the Washington Trust.
I see a number of familiar names and some familiar faces and some new ones. If you have not yet been able to join us for the webinar, we do have recordings of the past episodes that you can access. You just send us an email, or I think you can even find them on our website. But all of this 4-part series has been made possible through generous support from Harrison Goodall, who I'm so happy to see that we have on the meeting today. Harrison is, I like to say, a force for good in the historic preservation world, especially on the technical side. And from his donation, we are able to do this in order to help support capacity building and a deeper understanding of how to navigate flood mitigation and climate adaptation with historic properties. So a little bit of housekeeping. Unless you are our presenter, please keep yourself muted when you're not speaking. There will be time for Q&A, which either Jim or Alex or myself will call out and say, oh, now we have time for questions. If you like, you can raise your hand or come off mute and ask your question yourself. If you're feeling a little camera shy, you're welcome to put them into the chat as they occur to you, and whenever we get to the next designated Q&A session, we'll read them out for you if you like. But otherwise, please don't be shy. Feel free to leave your cameras on but muted. And we will have the recording of this, like the others, available to you after the fact. This webinar series is part of a larger effort being undertaken by both Maritime Washington National Heritage Area and the Washington Trust for Historic Preservation. We've been engaging in this conversation through some different avenues, one of which is the listing of the Coupeville Wharf as one of the most endangered places in the state because of the impacts to it from king tide events. We will be opening a sub-granting program aimed at rural communities this fall called Sea Park, which is funded through a competitive Paul Brune federal grant that the Washington Trust received from the National Park Service. And we are going to be using this webinar, some feedback from our upcoming Places conference, and from a few other avenues to compile together a resource guide available to the public, whether or not you end up applying for a grant or if you're eligible. We hope that the resource guide is available soon and meaningful and useful for a larger audience. This is our series, hopefully should seem familiar to a number of you. We're here at number 3, and our next webinar will be next week. We've taken you through how to understand your risk and the different types of impacts that flooding may have had on your property, navigating guidance from the National Park Service about how do you go about picking your adaptation or understanding some of the models of ways to compatibly alter buildings and properties so that they can be more resilient to flooding. Today we'll be going through, once you have an idea about how much water might be heading to you and what to do about it, how do you then figure out what kinds of permits and permissions and approvals and C of As you might need, and how do you make sure that you are doing everything in an above board fashion. Next week, we'll take you through how do you know if you need to hire an architect or an engineer or a landscape architect or a general contractor or what the case might be, so you can put together your team to set you up for success and get the project done. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Jim Thornton is an environmental permit coordinator in the Governor's Office of Regulatory Innovation and Assistance. Jim has 50 years of managerial and environmental policy, regulatory, and permitting experience in both government and in the private sector. His experience includes numerous projects that required field surveys and addressing potential impacts to cultural and archaeological resources. His project management has focused primarily on large energy infrastructure projects, including pipelines, transmission lines, power plants, LNG processing, and renewable energy projects. Jim has also presented at numerous conferences, prepared and given testimony at congressional and state legislative hearings, and served on a National Academy of Science subcommittee. Jim is currently the environmental permit coordinator. In this role, he helps developers, businesses, and individuals navigate the local, state, and federal environmental permitting processes in Washington state. So, who knows it better? Who's here to make it more simple? Probably, I think we couldn't have found anyone better to walk all of us through what can be a very daunting, complicated set of permitting regulations. So, Jim, enough from me. I'm going to stop sharing and pass it over to you for your slides.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, just a little introduction. That was all very good. Thank you for all those accolades. I wrote it myself, so I thank you very much. Yeah, I've had 50 years experience. This is my last year. I decided to retire. I just turned 79 on Saturday, so I'm finally going to call it quits. So permitting. Let me go to my slides here. Let me see. I'm still old school and learning a lot of this stuff. Where are we here? There we go. Okay. So
Jim,
how do I open up this whole screen?
if you go to the bottom right, there's a little it's presenter view. It looks almost like a screen.
It's a projector.
Oh, projector, yeah.
Do you see that little box on a stand next to your slide rule in your
Oh
lower
yeah, I see
right-hand
it.
corner? There you go. Also, happy belated birthday.
Woo!
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So one caveat right at the beginning, I'm going to be going through a lot of permitting. Like I said in the introduction, local, state, and federal permitting. But keep in mind that not all of these permits will apply to your project. Just keep that in mind. It can be really daunting because we're going to be covering a lot. But as I said, not all of them may apply to your project. So a little bit first about the Governor's Office of Regulatory Innovation and Assistance.
Hey, Jim, I don't think it didn't go into presenter view.
Okay.
If you want, do you want, I can just share your slides because I believe I have them and you can just tell me next. Would that work?
That will work. Did you get my latest one that had a lot of pictures in it?
Yes.
Okay, let's do that then because I don't see where I can share this on a wider scale.
Yeah, no worries. I got it. So if you, I will just steal your share here. Can everybody see that okay?
Looks
Okay,
good.
awesome. Yeah, Jim,
circle
just tell me when
plan.
you want me to go to the next slide and I will do so.
Yeah, next slide. So just our brief mission statement. I'm not going to read all of this, but it's important that the Office of Regulatory Innovation Assistance has actually been around for a long time, dating back into the 1990s when it was a part of the Department of Ecology's and it called the Environmental Permitting Assistance Center. And then over the years, it's changed quite a bit. In a lot of legislation, and I've listed a few of these here. Most importantly, most importantly is in 2003, the change to the Office of Regulatory Assistance. Prior to that, it always had been directed at environmental permitting. With the change in 2003, it included assisting small businesses in complying with state regulations. Over time, we're also given the authority to do regulatory improvement. And then most recently, going down to 2025, just this year, Governor Ferguson signed an executive order number 3, which is permitting accountability. And that executive order required all of the cabinet level agencies under the governor to report all of their permits and how long it takes them to process their permits, and is setting up a requirement that if agencies have a deadline to approve or disapprove a permit, and if they don't take action on it by that specified time, they have to reimburse the applicant for their initial application fee. And we're in the process right now of meeting with all the agencies and setting out kind of this standard. Give you an example of the magnitude of this. Araya also manages the state regulatory handbook. We had around 400, 500 regulations in that handbook. Now that we've completed this exercise of all the state agencies accounting for all of their regulations and permits, we now have 1,700 entries into our regulatory handbook. So that's been a real big lift for us, is updating our regulatory handbook and now meeting with agencies to establish a time limit for them to issue permits. Next slide. So do you need a permit? My theme is what color is a brown dog? And there's a story behind that. When I was a young Army officer and I was going to officer basic training, we were all in the first day, we're all in the barracks standing next to our bunks. Everything's neat, just perfect. In comes this captain, gives us a lecture in the do's and don'ts, in a very loud voice, telling us what we can do and not do. And then he ends it with, are there any questions? And of course, you could hear a pin drop in that room until one soldier, one candidate, says, yes, sir, I have a question. And the captain walks right up to him, 12 inches from his face, and is yelling at him, what is your question, soldier? And the soldier asks this question. And this captain, again, 12 inches from his face, shouting right into his face, what color is a brown dog? Well, nobody dared laugh, but it was pretty evident that the soldier had asked a self-evident question. And so I've remembered that day ever since. What color is a brown dog? Unfortunately, when it comes to permitting, it is not as simple as knowing what color is a brown dog. It's a lot more complicated than that. So we're going to talk about navigating the permitting process, federal, state, and local. Next slide. So it's important to describe your dog. Yeah, you know it's brown, but you need a better description than just brown. What does your dog do? Why do you need your dog? Then you need to go in your scope of work, your description of work, proposed timing of your work. You have to do your tribal, government, and public consultation. And what are the permits and regulatory requirements? You have to really describe your dog. So a lot of this may actually be included in a grant application, but it's important to have this down as accurate as possible. Describing your project, your purpose and need, that comes up. That's a really important aspect, especially if you ever have to do an environmental impact statement. And so keep these points in mind when you go into your regulatory process. You need to include all of these bullet points. Next slide. So let's get into what kind of permits you need for your brown dog. Corps of Engineers. It's probably a lot more than you ever thought of. I mean, I think most of you may be familiar with Section 404 permits, Clean Water Act. That's the basic core permit for dredging, dredge disposal, fill in waters of the U.S. Section 10 permit, work in the water, basically, and usually those two are issued together, Section 404 and Section 10 permits. By the way, for those of you who may not know, that Section 10 permit, the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899. So that's a really old law. Section 408, that's one that could really apply to a lot of your projects in the shoreline and the coastal areas. That is if there's a dike or some kind of federal approved water protection, like a dike, breakwater, etc. If you're going to impact that, there's a Section 408 review that has to go through the Corps of Engineers for approval. I think you're all going to be familiar with Section 106, the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 7 consultation, Endangered Species Act. Now that's important. I want to make a point on this one. It is not necessarily a permit, but in the Endangered Species Act, there's two sections, Section 7 consultation and Section 10. Section 7 is when the federal agency proposes an action if it impacts endangered species or their habitat. Keep that in mind too. Even if an endangered species is not on the site, if it has the habitat that would support that species, then Section 7 consultation is required. And Section 7 is, then you have to prepare an environmental assessment. And that goes to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or National Marine Fisheries Service for review. In most cases, you don't need a permit. However, if you do impact an endangered species or their habitat, then you might have to get a take permit. And that is a permit that allows you to potentially impact an endangered species. Then, of course, is the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, which, in the worst case, requires an environmental impact statement. Another federal permit that may be needed is Section 401. That's the U.S. Coast Guard. I've got to think about that. I may have made a mistake there. Anyway, there is a Coast Guard permit if you're impacting navigation. That is generally only related to a bridge. So if your project involves a bridge over a federal waterway or waters of the U.S., then a Coast Guard permit is required. Next slide. So we talked about federal consultations and approval, Endangered Species Act. The brown dog's not a candidate, threatened or endangered, but you may have to prove he or she is not. So the biological assessment, I mentioned that. You may have to do one of those, submit it to the Corps of Engineers so they can start consultation with the regulatory agencies. There's two primary ones, National Marine Fisheries Service, which covers marine and anadromous fish, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, terrestrial species and non-migratory fish. Another one that oftentimes comes up is avian resources. For instance, marbled murrelet. If you have old growth timber, marbled murrelet may you may have to do an environmental assessment on any potential impacts, and that comes under the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Next slide, please. So state permits. We should be down, should be going down to state permits. Do you all see that?
Are folks not
Yes.
seeing state permits?
Oh, okay, good. Because I have two screens here. I'm looking at another screen that still has one of the original slides. So state permits, good. So Department of Ecology, this is where I may have made a mistake on that Coast Guard permit. I need to check on that. It may be 401, but because under the Coast Guard Authority, it's under a different law that was passed, so it might still be Section 401. Department of Ecology, Section 401 comes from the Clean Water Act, the same as the Core 404 permit comes from the Clean Water Act. So the Section 401 of the Water Quality Clean Water Act is a certification. The certification that the federal permit you're getting does not violate state water quality standards. That is the state's, has been the state's main ability, let me put it that way, ability to regulate impacts to wetlands and waterways is through the Section 401. And they relied heavily on the Corps' process to do that. That's changed recently, where a Supreme Court decision really reduced the jurisdiction of the Core 404 permit. So a 401 is still issued when there's core jurisdiction, but a lot of projects today do not come under Core 404. We have the Coastal Zone Consistency Determination, Coastal Zone Management Act, and Waters of the State. Now, I'll bring that up because the state has lost their ability to regulate through the Corps' 404 permit, so that 401 is not applicable in a lot of cases. So the state is now regulating under their authority, RCW 9048, for waters of the state. That they issue an administrative order. So keep that in mind. It kind of replaces what the state was, how they were regulating under 401. Now it is an administrative order under their authority of RCW 9048. And then the other one is the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination Permit. That's NPDS. What you're going to, any kind of point discharge from your project, any changes to it would require an NPDS permit. And it also regulates stormwater, non-point pollution. So there's a statewide stormwater permit. Most of you would be covered under that, but that's another one to consider. Department of Fish and Wildlife, hydraulic project approval. Anytime you impact a water course, waterway, pond, creek, whatever, you're most likely going to need a Department of Fish and Wildlife hydraulic project approval. And Department of Natural Resources. Your project may require a lease, an aquatics land lease from the Department of Natural Resources. And I'm working on one right now in Grays Harbor County, working with Department of Natural Resources, actually on a major cable landing coming from Alaska and some coming from Asia. So an aquatic land lease, not a permit, but obviously a lease that you may need. Next slide. Local permits. Shoreline permit. So if you're within 200 feet of the high water mark on the upland side, a shoreline permit is likely required. In seaward, now we're talking about the ocean counties. Actually, the shoreline zone extends all the way out to the 3-mile state limit. You know, beyond 3 miles, it's federal. But if you're in Grays Harbor County, for example, their shoreline zone extends all the way out to the 3 miles. You may need a conditional use permit. In fact, in most cases, you do need a conditional use permit. Sometimes the shoreline permit takes the place of a conditional use, so you only need one, the shoreline permit. Critical area ordinances. Now, that's not a permit, but embedded in most local regulations is a requirement for critical area ordinances. So it's important to read the local jurisdictions, zoning regulations, because in there will be critical area ordinances that you'll have to address. Stormwater management. The state really relies on a lot of the local implementation of stormwater management. Again, maybe not a permit, but when you get into your conditional use or shoreline permit, stormwater management is going to be an important part of that. floodplain permit, another one that is important. And then, of course, SEPA, the State Environmental Policy Act. There are three decisions that are made by the local jurisdiction of the state. Declaration of non-significance does not have a significant impact on the environment. A mitigated declaration of non-significance. There is potential impacts. You've addressed those, though, by providing mitigation. And that's really important to expedite, in many cases, the process of getting a permit. Is if you can identify your impacts and mitigate upfront for them, oftentimes in consultation with the local jurisdiction, will help move your permit application through the SEPA process. And then, of course, the last one is being the determination of significance, and that requires an EIS. And of course, that can be a lengthy process. Now, just in timing, in my experience, many of the applications can get through the regulatory process in 6 to 9 months. But if you get into a determination of significance and an EIS, it could easily extend into a year or more. Next slide. FEMA. I don't know how many of you have had experience with FEMA. Basically comes down to the local jurisdiction's floodplain management, and can you insure your project? I won't go into each of these. This is an area that I am just really learning a lot about. After 50 years of doing this, I'm now finally dealing with some FEMA issues, and I'm finding it can be a lengthy and long process. So it's important, again, to talk to your local authority. And if you're in a floodplain zone and your project could change the floodplain characteristics, you might be in for a long and effort in trying to either change the floodplain designation. So I've just listed these here, the 4 basic things that FEMA looks at. I know this slideshow is going to be available to you afterwards, so you can read up a little bit more on these. And some of you may be very familiar with it. So let's go to the next slide. So we have really covered at this point most of the regulatory requirements. And so I want to open it up to questions right now. A couple of caveats. I kind of gave the brown dog question. In this case, there are no brown dog questions. Every question, if you don't know it, you need to know it. So don't be afraid to bring up a brown dog question. Secondly, I may not have the answer. Things are changing all the time. Regulations, laws are changing. And so ask the question, but I'm giving you kind of upfront, I may not know the answer. But maybe someone else on the call can answer. So do we have any questions?
Yes, I see one in the chat. And as a reminder, please feel free to put questions in the chat or to use the raise hand function. Or if you can't figure that out, just come off mute and say something so we know. But I see a question from Aaron in the chat. Can you please go back and speak about tribal consultation?
I think
Okay.
pausing for now to get questions on what we've talked about so far. That was a preview of what we will be talking about next. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
Got it. Okay, Aaron, questions tabled for now. Barbara, do I see that you're off mute? Is that on purpose?
It is. So I have a question. There was a lot of permit areas that were listed there. In the past, I've gone through the process and completed a SEPA application, a hydraulic permit application, and a JARPA, Joint Aquatics Permit application that covered, I think, the core and some of these others. So I'm not sure, as you've listed these, is this is the process different where these applications now need to be separately filed, or does that JARPA still kind of cover all of those agencies?
Good question, and I'm going to cover that more in
Oh, good.
detail
Okay.
under the good news. We have a slide on good news and bad news.
Oh, you're not
And
to the
so,
good news yet.
but to directly answer your question, yes, JARPA is still applicable. That's one application for many of those permits. And in fact, we're in the process of revising JARPA right now to flow a little bit better. There was a lot of redundancies in it. And so we're working with the other agencies to make it a little more reader friendly. I can't say we're going to reduce it, but make it more reader friendly.
Okay. I have two other questions, if it's okay.
Sure.
So another question is, in my experience, is in reading through the act and looking at what the state's value is on restoring historic buildings and preserving them, I feel like investing in these buildings is in the interest of the state. And yet, my experience is that when you apply for these permits, the first thing they ask for is, what are you going to do to mitigate the environmental impact of your actions? Without any consideration that part of what you're doing is a state valued function. And I'm wondering if there's any movement in that. It's just been a frustration mostly for me.
I think to answer your question up front is no, there isn't.
That's in the bad news
Now,
section.
yeah. Now, I will also add, I share your frustration. This is not the only area, I think, of frustration. The other one is there's a lot of effort on restoration of salmon habitat, other marine habitat, even climate resiliency projects, grants that people get. And they face the same issue.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah,
they have a potential impact. Well, how are you going to mitigate for it? Kind
right,
of ignoring that what they're doing is mitigation.
right, exactly.
And so it falls in that same basket that you're talking about. And there, on the fish side of things, climate resilience side, there has been some legislation introduced that would help expedite that. In fact, it would have come to our office and primarily land on my shoulders to help expedite permits through the local and state processes and get those permits faster and like you said, address the mitigation issues. That has failed twice in the legislature. So I think it's very worthy. Kind of behind the scenes this year, there's a group of both state regulators, lobbyist groups that are interested on the environmental side of thinking about reintroducing that legislation. But again, it doesn't address your thoughts on historic properties, which I think is absolutely worthwhile and should be. So I agree with you, but it can't help you.
But sorry. Third question then is, when I went through this process before for a pretty minor effort, it was dealing with scouring on some pier blocks. The core was, I would say, pretty much not helpful.
Pretty much what?
Not helpful.
Oh.
I mean, we made it anyway,
Right.
but it was, it was a kind of a 2-year process, and and so I'm wondering, with all of the changes, state level, national level, if there's, particularly for projects that are in line with sort of the policy direction, if there's some movement at the core to kind of speed those things up.
Again, not good news.
Great.
It's getting worse. It's getting worse. And it's not just the Corps, but it's National Marine Fisheries Service, it's FEMA, it's all the federal agencies.
Yeah.
We're understaffed before, and it's worse now.
Got it. All
And
right.
so it's difficult for them to manage the projects because they have less people. The people they do have oftentimes are inexperienced, which tends to make them more cautious. So yeah, the only, I think, recommendation that I can give you is, and others on the call, is if you have those kinds of circumstances, call Araya, call us.
Okay.
And we are tasked to helping people get through the regulatory process. And that includes the federal process. And we can actually, and I've done this several times in the last couple of years, is I will get all the agencies together in one room and talk about the project and how we can get this through the permitting process. So that is part of our role, part of our mission
Right.
is to do that. So that can be the good news, and that has worked. I'll be frank about that. You know, we're in the governor's office, and when we call, we're from the governor's office.
Yeah, they take your call.
Yeah, I mean, we have no regulatory authority at all, absolutely. But nonetheless, it's that being able to bring people together, and when the agencies get a call from the governor's office, they're usually pretty responsive. So that's it. That's the good news I can give you. Bad news is I'm retiring in 3 months, so
I better get my project going.
yes, but there will be someone else here in Araya. There, you know, we will still be able to help. So, you know, that's the one good news I can give you.
I thought the governor had some authority to, I don't remember the specifics of this, but in certain cases to override some of these, this process, to declare it. There was some declaration I read, I remember, that the governor could make that would allow a project to go forward. I'd have to review my research on that, but does that ring a bell?
No.
Okay. All right.
But what I will say, and a good example, and some of you may remember the orca whale, Tokia, that was going to be moved from the Sea Aquarium in Miami to a large net pen in Puget Sound. And that was a huge project. And what happened on that one is the Governor Inslee said, get it done. And he tasked us with doing that. And he told the agencies, get it done. Now, that doesn't mean he overrides everything or anything, but basically it's an order coming from the governor saying, get that done. And we were well into the process when, unfortunately, Tokita died in the aquarium. But that is something the governor can do. You know, if it's a project that's really important and has a lot of significance, the governor can say, get it done.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate.
Okay.
I think we need to wrap up Q&A and get back into Jim's presentation for the sake of time. So Alex, if you don't mind queuing those slides back up.
Yeah, we'll do. And just a reminder to folks, we'll have another time for Q&A at the end. So keep your questions handy.
Okay.
And another reminder to stay on mute if you're not, Jim, please.
So I know I probably went through the permitting really, really fast. I'll try to go a little bit slower this time, but certainly, you know, if you have questions, things come to mind on the permits, you know, bring them up at the end of the presentation. So tribal and community consultation. And again, really, is your dog really brown? I mean, you need to go out and ask the tribes and the community, is your dog really brown? The importance of tribal consultation is really taken on a lot of significance over the last probably 10 years, 15 years. When I worked for ecology back in the in the 70s, actually. Yeah, there was some tribal consultation, but it wasn't really something that was taken seriously, honestly. Today it is. Today it's very important to seek the tribe's thoughts, consultation with them. And there's kind of two things that I've learned. One is, as a proponent for a project, it's really important to engage the tribe if you can, and sometimes tribes, especially the coastal ones. But keep in mind, once you've submitted your permit application, most of the tribes at that point expect it to be government to government consultation. So an important key for that consultation is do what you can at the beginning to engage the tribe, find out what their issues are, how to address them, provide mitigation if it's is appropriate, do your archaeological surveys, etc. Engage with the tribe on that. But once that permit application is in, and again, I can't speak for the tribes, but I believe many of the tribes then expect there to be government to government consultation. And that, in some cases, has failed, not taken seriously by the agency. So here's just a kind of a little upfront advice. Make sure that the agency that you're submitting your applications to, that they are engaging with the tribes, because that can become a point at the end. If they issue a permit and haven't engaged the tribe, that makes it very open to appeal by the tribes. So it's important that consultation be taken seriously and be done at the appropriate times in the permitting process. Up front, you as the applicant engage. After the permit application is submitted, that the agency is engaged. Again, I'll go back to the beginning in a few questions. Your project description, your purpose and need, description of the work, and the proposed timing of the work are all important things that you should be prepared. I have worked on the private side with clients who engaging with the tribe weren't very forthcoming. They're going to say, well, we're going to do this project, this is what it is, and kind of leave it at that, and really don't engage with the tribe on the project so the tribe can really understand what impacts there may be to traditional and cultural properties. And so it's important to go to the tribe with as much information as you can and as early in the process as you can. Next slide. So here's some other points on consulting with tribes, community interests. Why do you do it? Well, you do it to solicit support for your project. On the other hand, you may also find out where people don't support your project and what their issues are and how to address those issues. You're not going to be able to convince 100% of the people 100% of the time, as they say, but you can find out what the issues are, and you want to solicit support in the community. Identify unintended consequences. I always find this one interesting, is because usually when you're proposing a project, and I've worked for a lot of clients, you think of all the good things, all the wonderful things you're doing, but you don't necessarily look at what might happen that really were not intended. Another issue I don't really have in here, but is today in Washington State, most of the agencies have to look at impacts on distressed communities, underserved communities. You need to know in your project, are you displacing, say, a low-income community, or impacting low-income community or other distressed populations, minority populations. So identify as best you can unintended consequences of your project. Look to resolve conflicts. Again, you solicit support, but you find out there's a major issue with an adjacent landowner. Can you resolve that conflict? Value-added opportunities. This is one a lot of I think applicants don't think about. Are there value-added opportunities that you can add to your project, maybe at little cost or little effort, but bring more value to your project and to the community? Today that's another thing. Most of my work has been in the energy realm, renewable energy projects, wind and solar projects, and one of the things they look at is what values can you add to your project for the community. So even in a smaller project, what can you do to bring value added? It might be putting in a new sidewalk in a community. It might be some other amenities. The other thing is identify local code requirements. As I mentioned, oftentimes within a local jurisdiction's zoning requirements, permitting requirements, there are other code requirements that you need to be aware of to make sure your project does not get hung up. I've worked on the private sector with big projects that didn't account for how many fire hydrants they needed in their project. And they get into the permitting process and the fire department comes out and says, oh, you can't do that. You don't have enough fire hydrants, or your access roads are too narrow. So it's important, and this is why you have pre-application meetings with the local authorities. In that local jurisdiction, that planning director, there is planners will hold a meeting, and they will and ask that everyone be at the table who's going to be involved in reviewing your permit application. So make sure the fire department's there, the police department's there, the engineering department. So identify those local code requirements early on, so your permit does not get hung up later in the review process. And last, avoid permitting delays. So again, in my experience, one of the major delays in permitting is the applicant itself changes something in their project. They get into the permitting and then they realize, oh, we need a new access road. And sometimes that requires kind of going back to the beginning and starting over again. So that's why it's really important to get your project down as complete as possible and avoid those permitting delays. The other one is avoid permitting delays about timing. This doesn't apply everywhere, but you take a lot of rural counties, small staff. Maybe one person is the county engineer and the planner. I know of one county that I've dealt with, that's the case. He's also a farmer. He's got to do harvest time, August, September. Don't think much is going to get done during August and September. Despite his role as a public servant, he has other responsibilities. So think about that and make sure that you've talked to them and that they have the staff. Another way to avoid permitting delays, and this is probably difficult for many of you working in historic preservation, but that is you literally pay the local jurisdiction to hire a consultant to help them through the process. That's for the bigger level projects where the county's understaffed. It's going to take a long time for them to work through it. Do you have monies that you can then enter into a cost reimbursement agreement with that local authority to process your permit in a more timely fashion? Next slide. Okay, here we go. Is there any good news? Well, let's go back at the very beginning. Not all of these permits I brought up may be applicable to your project. Some permits may be exempt or expedited. For instance, if you have an historic building and there was a storm and something got damaged, you may be exempt from SEPA. You may be exempt from a shoreline permit because it's maintenance. Corps of Engineers, same thing. We talked about the Corps earlier. Your project may be subject or come under a nationwide permit, which expedites the process significantly. Sometimes it's only a notification to the Corps that this is what you're going to do. So there are some 50 plus, I think, nationwide permits, and one is for maintenance. But check to see if your project is exempt or is subject to like a nationwide permit. As long as you comply with the requirements of the nationwide permit, you're good to go. Same with the 401 water quality certification from Ecology. I mean, they may have already pre-approved some kinds of projects, so you don't have to get one. So again, look to see if your project is exempt or can be expedited. Some may, like the Department of Fish and Wildlife, hydraulic projects in an emergency. I mean, that avoids going to a public process. And many of these kind of exempt the project from going to a public notice or public hearing. Regarding your question about JARPA, most common permits can be applied for by using JARPA. That's a Joint Aquatic Resource Permit application. Our office manages that permit. So if you have questions on that, just call our center, and our folks can help you through that JARPA process. And as I mentioned, we're looking at and working with the agencies to make it a little bit more user-friendly and reduce some of the redundancies in it, et cetera. Some assessments can be used to address other agencies' concerns. So don't think you have to do something special for each agency. I mentioned a good one is if you do a environmental assessment for an endangered species, that can also be used for a critical area ordinance where you have conservation areas, where you might have to do a wildlife habitat assessment. So that may be available and reduce redundancies. And then lastly, again, we can assist you in navigating the permit process and coordinate permits. Our call center answers many of the questions regarding environmental permitting. And then we have three other laws, or not three other laws, but three other means we can help you. One is early in your process, we can do an evaluation of the potential impacts of your project. So we call it an ECA, environmental considerations and constraints analysis. So we can do this and say, well, here are the environmental attributes in your area, things that you should know about, and here's what may environmental issues you might need to address. So that's what I do. I help you navigate the environmental permitting process. I'm working on a marina restoration project. I'm working on this off the coast cable project, etc. So I help applicants and navigate that the regulatory process. We can also we can coordinate all the permitting. Now, this is for more complex projects, but we can coordinate among all the agencies the permitting. Now, currently, that's a cost reimbursement. This is usually for private applicants that come with a big project, and they've got a lot of agencies they have to consult with. They would literally enter into a cost reimbursement agreement with us, and we then help them navigate through that process, including consultation with our other agencies. So that's probably limited to you because it is cost reimbursement. We also are working on some ways that for grants in the state of Washington, we would do that as a service. But that's not the case yet, but we're working on that. The third one is, again, under cost reimbursement, we can literally form a team. We can bring in Department of Ecology member, Fish and Wildlife member, Department of Natural Resource member, et cetera. And we as a team would permit the project. Again, I think that's more focused on big, large projects and it's cost reimbursement. But I think most importantly for your purposes, just providing that early navigation on how to get, what permits you need and how to get through the process. That's a service that we can provide. So next slide, please. Permits exempt. This is a good example of one. Iwaka Landing, January 2023. The Iwaka Landing, it was a private pier servicing the marine industry. It was a landing of seafood, primarily crab. In January of 2023, it caught fire and burned down, destroyed 6,000 crab pots and their refrigeration units and everything. And this is the picture I took of what was left of the Iwaka Landing. So we were actually contacted by a state legislature to help get this permitted as quickly as possible. So our office worked with the city of Iwaka, the county, the congressional office, state offices, Corps of Engineers, and we got through the permitting process with all permits in 6 months. Now, this was a major project. As you can see, it was really destroyed. That included debris cleanup. There was some contamination that had to be removed, and et cetera. But literally from the day we started into the permitting of this, we got it done in 6 months. Again, many of these were exempt. We went through that process. Oh, and here's another point. Just because a project is exempt, you may still have to submit an application to the county. For instance, a project I'm working on the Tacoma Tide Flats. It is definitely a maintenance project. And we met with the city of Tacoma and they said, oh yeah, that's exempt. You don't need a shoreline permit. However, you have to apply for the exemption. So keep that in mind. Just because you're exempt and you read you're exempt, you still may have to apply for the exemption. Next slide. Okay, so what if your brown dog runs away? Yeah, what can go wrong? So time delays. I mentioned this previously, incomplete or inaccurate permit applications. Agencies will stop the process, send it back to you, the clock stops, you have to start over, resubmit, or provide that information to them. Revisions to project after permit submittal. Okay, so now same thing. They stop the clock, may even have to restart over again to make those revisions. Now, keep this in mind. If your revision is a small one, and this is what I advise clients, and I may get a lot of pushback from local jurisdictions, and I'd love to hear from this on this, but I would tell my clients, don't go back to the agency with a small change or revision. Complete your permitting process. And then if, again, this is a big if that change involves no significant environmental impacts, you can prepare an addendum to the SEPA. And I recommend this in a lot of cases. I'm doing it one right now, where the addendum provides supporting information on what was changed and why it was changed. So the agency even knows. I mean, sometimes I'd have clients that make changes and not tell the agency, and then there'd be some kind of violation afterwards. No, let them know. And in the state of Washington, at least, you can look at an addendum. Again, I bring this up, but it's for minor and doesn't have any kind of significant environmental impacts. So keep that in mind. Don't gum up the process by going back to the agency with small changes to your project. Finding out your project has a significant impact. Well, obviously, then that could end up being an environmental impact statement. That's why you did public consultation, tribal consultation up front, is to avoid finding out later that you overlooked something that had a significant impact or could be appealed. Something that wasn't addressed that could be appealed. I also mentioned earlier agency staff limitations, especially small counties with small staff have limited time. They may have a lot of projects in limited time, and that can really delay a project. And if you can, are there ways that you can expedite that process? I even worked on projects where we as a company would embed someone in a local agency's jurisdiction. So we would take an employee that we're paying for, but allocate them to the local authority under that local authority's jurisdiction that could oversee their work. So we could avoid any kind of conflicts of interest. Some agencies will allow that. Others see it as a conflict of interest, but that is one thing you might be able to do to overcome the agency staff limitations. And I'll also mention that may be done because they lack expertise. This is one thing that really gets to me. I work on a lot of renewable energy projects, and local agencies, when they get, and what's a big issue right now is what's called a BESS, a battery storage, battery energy storage system. And this is BESS. A lot of local agencies have never seen these before. They don't know how to address them. There's lots of fire codes, national things, but they don't know how to address those. So sometimes maybe you can provide some expertise that can help them in reviewing that your permit application, or help them find the resources to do that. The state oftentimes has resources that a local agency can use and get to address issues. Now, and this was brought up just a little while ago, agencies with extraordinary permit backlogs. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries Service. I'll now add another bullet in there, Corps of Engineers, and FEMA. All of these agencies are under a lot of stress because of staff reductions and money reductions. So keep that in mind. You may need a long lead time. I don't know of any magic bullet that can overcome those, other than very open communications, early communications. And if it helps, contact our office where we can call these agencies and see if we can move things along a little faster. Next. So one of the things that's important is site investigations. Before you get working on your permit application, some things you really need to know. Your projects, and some of these are pretty self-evident, but again, kind of the brown dog equation may be self-evident, but you still need to know these and have them in your application. Project site dimension and features. Is a site survey already available? Extremely important is identify your ordinary high water mark in 200 feet landward. Your wetland survey, if present, a wetland delineation. Water features such as ponds and streams. Where is the boundary line? Existing site structures. This is not something that often comes up. You might you need to include all of the structures on your site and what stays and what goes. Are you demolishing anything? If you're demolishing something, you may need a demolition permit. Didn't bring that up earlier, but if you are going to demolish something, you may need a demolition permit. The cultural and historic surveys. Oh, we've got one. Oh yeah, it was done in 1954. Well, that may not cut it today. If old or incomplete, it may need to be updated. Habitat surveys for sensitive plant and animal species. And here's one that's often forgotten. Presence of invasive species. You have an acre of Scotch broom, canary reed grass, invasive species. That's bad. That's not good. But on the other hand, it might be, if you take care of those, mitigation. If you get rid of the Scotch broom, the canary reed grass, that is mitigation credits you can get for your project. Next slide. Estimate amount and location of excavated or filled material. This is another one. Oftentimes, local jurisdictions, state agencies will ask, okay, you're going to excavate 10,000 cubic yards. where are you going to put it? What are you going to impact? Okay, the excavation may be fine, but where you're going to put it may not be. And then your mitigation measures, such as wetland mitigation, erosion, sedimentation, water quality, invasive species. Again, I'll add with that, that comes to your plant species that you may be able to mitigate. Protection of historical cultural properties, and then critical areas. How are you going to protect or mitigate for impacts in critical areas? And that's another important point is, again, I brought it up earlier, almost all, well, I think all local jurisdictions have critical area ordinances. Make sure you read those. And if you're impacting those, you may have to do some kind of study to show whether you're impacting those. And if you are, how you're going to mitigate for those impacts. And I think the picture here, that last picture, is that's canary reed grass. Okay, next. Costs. Well, as you can imagine, that really can vary. I mean, from, as I mentioned, area of impact, magnitude, resource impact, and permitting requirements all reflect costs. There are many other issues that can get into that. So here's just some examples. A wetland delineation report. This has actually gone down a lot over the years. 5 acres, $5,000 is kind of a rule of thumb, but can easily exceed if it's complex. Today, and give you an example, and I assume most of the consulting firms that do wetland delineations or individuals who do it, they use a laptop. And it's geolocation. They can go out, they can identify a spot, they have to dig a hole, look at whether it's the soils indicate it's a wetland, and then they can record that spot on their computer in the field. Used to be you'd have to have a survey crew. You put a stake in the ground and you'd go around and literally surveyors would come in and survey in where those stakes were. Well, you can imagine the cost for a surveyor to go out and do that would be $10,000, $15,000, $20,000. Well, now it can all be done someone with a handheld computer in the field. Habitat survey and report, 5 acres, $2,500. There's a lot of, I'll call them single biologists out there. Oftentimes you can find your area who's well qualified to do this work. But if you have any insensitive species, well, the cost will start going up. And permit application, agency consultation through that process, approximately plus or minus 10,000. Next slide. Time. And again, depends on many factors. So the simplest project, the ones I've had going through the local jurisdiction permitting process, complete application, etc., 6 to 9 months. Larger projects involving several agencies, extended environmental review, 12 to 16 months. Really important that pre-application efforts, the tribal consultation, community consultation, and a pre-application meetings with the agencies can really create a more seamless and timely permitting process. Next one. So Araya. Again, I'll read this. Despite the warning not to ask what color is a brown dog, sometimes we just need to confirm that indeed the dog is brown. So Araya has a number of resources. The regulatory handbook. Like I said, we've gone from several hundred entries in the regulatory handbook to 1,700. Now, that covers everything from the environmental ones that you're most concerned about to cosmetics. So it's broad range, but it's organized in a way that hopefully you'll be able to quickly find information you need for environmental guidance. Guidance and assistance in permitting. That is, again, a role that I play and that Araya does. The next one is prepare a site environmental characteristics and consequence analysis. That is something we do as a service. So we can look at your project site and tell you what are your environmental characteristics of that site, and what are the consequences? You know, what kind of permits you may need. Now, we actually have a contract with a private company who helps us do that. They do it commercially. And oftentimes it's $10,000, $15,000 for them to do it. They allow us to do it free. We can do it for one project per applicant. We can't do multiple ones, but we can do one project per applicant free. Permit coordination, I mentioned that. Cost reimbursement, we're hoping that we can get, especially for state grants, that if an applicant comes in, they have a state grant to say restore some historic property or protect some historic property, we'll be able to do that cost free. But right now it's cost reimbursement. And that other one I mentioned, the interagency permitting team, same thing. So next question. There's our contact information. The phone numbers are into our call center. Very knowledgeable people who can answer most questions. If they can't, they either refer it to me or they refer it to Department of Ecology, Department of Natural Resources. They have the contacts to get you the answer that you need. And it's also a live support chat line that you can contact them. So I think that's it. Is there another slide? I don't think so. No?
Nope.
Okay.
I think that's
Open to
it.
questions. We have 15 minutes.
We have 15 minutes. Erin, I messaged you in the chat. Let me know if you want to go back and talk a little bit more about tribal consultation. But while we're waiting to hear from Erin, there was a question that came in from Brian, who unfortunately had to leave the meeting a little bit earlier, but he's going to listen to your answer on the recording. And he asked, can ORIA assist with appeals of these permits? And is the report that identified 1,700 state permits going to address the appeals process, which can add well over a year to the permitting process? So I think it's mostly an appeals-based question. Let me know if you want me to repeat it because it's a little long.
No, I got it. The answer is no, we really can't. We have no regulatory authority. We can't interfere into an appeal. If you're an applicant, you've gone through the permitting process and it's being appealed or it's in the appeal process, you could always talk to me about my ideas and thoughts. I'll be honest, like, hey, you've got a problem, or did you think about this approach? Or so I can certainly opine, but I can't really interfere in that process. And I shouldn't say we, ORIA can't interfere into that process.
Okay. Speaking of asking you some questions and hearing what you have to say, I have some questions of my own, Jim, if you don't mind.
Oh, no, you're not allowed.
Oh, no, I missed my chance. Okay, well, just in case.
But don't ask a brown dog question, okay?
I don't promise that. But it seemed like some of what you were mentioning had to do with larger projects, multiple agencies, big review.
Yes.
Big impacts, large, complicated projects. And I know that we have people who either are in attendance today or will want to watch this, especially potential applicants for the sub-granting program we're coming up with, because those will be smaller dollar amount grants. Could we talk a little bit about smaller projects, maybe projects by individual homeowners? And I wanted to know, I have two questions in mind, but do you want to talk a little bit about tribal and community consultation when it applies or doesn't to small projects? Say an individual homeowner wanted to elevate their property by 4 feet, and that's the project. Because you talked about doing community consultation and interagency consultation and tribal. Could you talk a little bit about how that might look different at a different scale?
Okay, some number of things come to mind. And you're right, we do get questions. I mean, I had a homeowner who wanted to build a new pipeline to their septic system, and they're in the shoreline zone. And the local agency told them, fill out a JARPA form. This was a couple in their 80s. It would be easier rather than filling out the JARPA form. And this is an unfortunate thing. Some local agencies use the JARPA form as their permit application for many things. And this was a case where they contacted the local jurisdiction. The local jurisdiction said, fill out the JARPA form. So a lot of what I've said doesn't apply to them. Because they're in the shoreline zone, they need a shoreline permit. They don't need to do tribal consultation or community consultation. They don't need to do an endangered species study. So now they may have to obviously describe the project. They're going to dig a ditch. So how much are they going to excavate? Where are they going to put it? Probably on their property, fill in some area, etc. So you're right. And some of this work may actually be exempt, small work like that. Again, check with the local authority. It's always an order of magnitude. Really small projects, you probably don't need to go through all of this. But let me also give you an example, and that is a homeowner, and this is from experience many years ago, not here at Raya, but we had a client who was putting in a large bulkhead across their property. These people obviously had money. It's going to be a long extent shorefront. And they ran into Native American graves. They had no idea it was there. They had not done any kind of cultural survey in advance. But my admonition is here, whenever you're working in the shoreline, even if you're a small landowner, be aware that you may run into tribal, traditional cultural properties. And of course, this ended up in a big issue, which cost the landowner a lot of money. And that's where a small project, which was relatively small, can really hang you up. So my advice is on something like that, even though your project may be small, when you're in the shoreline area, be aware that there can really be some sensitive issues, especially towards cultural issues, and do what you can. Here's an example. Here's a little bit of advice. It may cost you a landowner or someone some money, but the Department of Agriculture, Archaeological and Historic Preservation, they have DAP Ruth. They keep all the records of all surveys ever done. And a licensed archaeologist or an approved archaeologist can access that database to determine if there's ever been any surveys done in the vicinity of your project. And so at least you have some idea that maybe 200 feet away, someone had found some artifacts at one time. Might give you a clue that maybe you should look at your property. So it's really important to just keep that in mind. The chances are probably really small, but it's one of those that risk table, small risk, but high consequence,
Yes. No, I think that's great advice. I, as you know, Jim, I used to be involved with reviewing permits, and I remember there would be projects where you didn't need a permit for painting your house, but people would get caught up because you did need a permit for the scaffolding, right? And so doing that kind of consultation where you just quickly read and go, oh, I don't need a permit to paint, done. Someone like me might go, but how are you going to paint? Are you going to block the sidewalk? Are you going to need to park your truck or get a dumpster? Or, so that kind of consultation is super helpful, and it's a nicer story to tell than when someone tried to build a pool and found 32 bodies. So, but I know what you mean. I mean, that stuff can, even
Well,
on a
yeah,
small project, can just happen.
yeah, and another example of that is, oh, you're going to do some land work, et cetera, but you didn't think about how you're going to get the backhoe to your property.
Yep.
Well, now you may be impacting some critical habitat,
Yep.
because you've got to clear an area to bring in your backhoe. So yeah, that's what gets back to that point of unintended consequences. You didn't think about that, and so it comes back to bite you.
Yeah. And then the other question I had was, you had given a sense about some potential anticipated permitting costs, but I was wondering if you could talk about those again at a smaller homeowner level. Have you gotten a sense of what the scale is like for a small individual property scale to get their permitting and all that through?
Not really. I mean, if a really small project, um, much of the work you can probably do yourself, or your agency or your association. You may have people who can do it to help you out in that permit application. You can arrange the pre-application meeting yourself. Now, keep in mind, there's usually a cost associated with that. Local jurisdictions, it might be a minimal $50. It might be $250 for that consultation. And then out of that, they may say, oh, you've got to do a wetland delineation. Well, now you're going to need some professional help usually for that. But I would also recommend, especially for associations or communities, et cetera, there may be people in your association who can help with that work, do it pro bono or even at minimal cost. So, but I don't have a really good cost estimate to what a local small job would be.
Yeah, my guess might be in the hundreds to thousands range rather than the tens of thousands
Yes, yeah, I worked with
for a
a
sense of scale.
homeowner on Whidbey Island. She had hired a local wetland company to do the wetland delineation, and it was $3,600.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, she found out her chicken pen was in the wetland.
Yeah.
She didn't apply for the permit.
Yeah. Sometimes you choose to back away from that question, but
Yes,
okay.
right. Yeah. That's the other thing. Sometimes you have these great plans, you're going to do these things, but when you start doing some of this, you can say, wow, I may be biting off more than I can chew. The costs are going to be greater than I thought, or it can raise a whole bunch of issues that I don't necessarily want, to be attention brought to me right now. And I will say that, like in this woman's case, that chicken coop, which was like for 40 or 50 chickens, had been there for 50 years, and the wetland had formed around that. So again, that's something that you don't, even though it was historical, you don't want to kind of bring that up, address that, just leave as is. The wetland was functioning fine, things look good. Another one I ran into is an old barn, and they wanted to do some work on the barn, and the landowner originally, going back 70 years, had rechanneled a creek that then he could block off the creek and use it to flush out his dairy barn. So some of these old practices, when the ecology and Department of Fish and Wildlife came out, even though this had been rechanneled,
Right.
it was now a creek. It was waters of the state.
Right.
So, in that case, you don't want to mess with it. You don't want to go there.
Right. Right. Yeah. Existing conditions can be complex. Well, I think we have a 1-minute warning. We do have to wrap it up. We're almost at 1:30. Is the best way, if people have further questions, to do that hello email for Aurea to reach you?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
And if they have a question specifically for me, they can just ask to
They'll
talk
ask
to
for
me.
Jim. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I will put that email address in the chat. Oh, Someone beat me to it. Thank you, Alex. And Jim, I just wanted to say thank you so, so much. I am going to quickly, in our last minute, share my screen because we have some next steps.
Moira, before we do that, can I just get a quick little round of applause for Jim? This is very complex subject matter, and you've done a really good job of explaining it. So thank you very much, Jim, for joining us.
You're welcome, and I certainly welcome criticisms and corrections.
Well, we don't have time for that, Jim, so you'll only have to accept applause.
Okay, all right, good.
No criticism, no corrections just now. But we do welcome those as well. So after this webinar, you will receive a recording of the session as well as a link to a survey. This is not your average I liked it, I didn't like it survey. We are really seeking some thoughtful feedback if we can get it. So you can do it after each session of the webinar, you can do it after the whole series, but we are looking to gauge where people still need help, what kinds of help people need, because we're using that to shape our resource guide that we're developing. So please do take just a few minutes. And as a reminder, we have one more session after this. That'll be next week. It's all about assembling your team and getting down to doing the work and figuring out how you go about that. And in our last 2 seconds, can we give one more quick round of applause for Jim? Thank you so much, Jim. Thank you for everything. Thank you all for attending, and thank you again so much to Harrison Goodall for making this all possible. All right, that about does us, I think.